We seem to have a particularly conflicted attitude toward sexuality. It's full of contradictions. We fear being labeled as lustful, yet due to a lack of sex education and heavy repression, we quietly crave anything that stirs desire, even if we refuse to admit it publicly. When we use the word vulgar in the name of morality to label all erotic content, we are not just confusing two concepts with subtle but real differences. We're also burying some truly profound artistic works. Take pornography, for example. Those factory-style videos made solely for stimulation versus eroticism, which can transcend the physical and touch the soul. They are fundamentally different. Hi everyone, I'm Shengli Shidwo. Today, I want to introduce a French philosopher, Georges Bataille. In his book, The History of Eroticism, he offers a view of sexuality that I think is deeply unsettling and brilliant. Bataille, in my view, is like the 20th century version of the Marquis de Sade. Take his book, The Story of the Eye. It reads like an attempt to outdo de Sade in explicitness. It's intense. It dives deep into sadomasochism, fetishes, even adult diaper play. If you're an adult and curious, you can easily find a PDF online. It's one of the most explicit, yet strangely philosophical and artistic books you'll ever read. And believe it or not, Bataille even wrote that he once pleasured himself in front of his mother's corpse. Yes, that's real. Now imagine what would happen if this kind of writing existed in today's China or even in our past. You can guess how that would end. But setting aside the shock value, we must admit that Bataille wasn't just being perverse. He was trying to express his personal philosophy through sexuality. In fact, he believed his entire life was a work of art, a philosophical and spiritual journey that had to be experienced through the lens of eroticism. But we must admit one thing. It's entirely fair to say that Bataille used sexuality to express his philosophy. Or more precisely, Bataille himself would have said that his entire life was a philosophical and artistic experiment, a deeply existential experience of being. But to him, that experience could only be reached through eroticism. Why? Because in his view, eroticism was the purest affirmation of life. Eroticism connects life and death, the sacred and the profane, control and transgression. If you watched my previous video, you've probably noticed that this episode is a direct follow-up to that discussion about desire and death. Just a small philosophical addition. In his book, The History of Eroticism, Bataille emphasizes that erotic experience is not a simple physical response. It touches the core contradiction of what it means to be human. He believes that what separates us from animals is our ability to place limits on sexual urges. We create taboos, boundaries, to regulate our sexual behavior. But ironically, taboos do not suppress desire. In fact, they can make desire even more intense. They awaken our urges at their most primal level. In other words, breaking a taboo can be more satisfying than sex itself. The thrill lies in the forbidden. That's why things like cheating, affairs, incest, or taboo fantasies stir such curiosity. The more forbidden something is, the more we want to try it. And that is precisely why taboo and transgression depend on each other. Without taboos, transgression doesn't exist, and each act of transgression only reaffirms the importance of the taboo itself. It is in this dialectical tension that Bataille saw the true structure of eroticism. It's through breaking taboos that the isolated individual dissolves, and what emerges is an experience that feels almost sacred. Building on that idea, Bataille divided erotic experience into three distinct forms, or we could say, three dimensions. The first is physical eroticism, which is about pure physical pleasure. The second is emotional eroticism, where passion is tied to love. The third is sacred eroticism, which comes from religious or mystical experience. These three forms can be seen as a spectrum from the everyday to the divine. They represent eroticism moving from the body to the spirit, from the physical to the metaphysical. Of course, even though these three have different forms and levels, they all share one core idea: to replace the disconnection of life with a sense of unity, to make us feel connected. In simple terms, all forms of eroticism are attempts to break down the walls that keep people apart, to reach a deeper sense of togetherness. As Bataille himself put it, The purpose of erotic acts is to touch the most private, hidden parts of our being, to the point where we almost lose ourselves, whether it's physical, emotional, or sacred passion. The boundaries around the self are temporarily broken down, shattered even, and in that moment, between people or between human and divine, there's a flash of unity, brief but intense. Let's begin with physical eroticism. It's focused on the body, on pleasure for its own sake. It goes beyond basic sex meant for reproduction. At this level, eroticism is about exploring the senses and exploring the body itself. It seeks pleasure, not offspring. And that's why physical eroticism is the most common. In modern society, it's also the one most often viewed as low, as something animalistic. But according to Bataille, what makes it meaningful is that humans have placed rational limits and taboos on sex. Sexual pleasure was finally freed from its biological role in reproduction. In other words, humans began to seek pleasure from desire itself, and that pursuit, in itself, is a step beyond animal instinct. It is a product of civilized life. Because of that, physical eroticism is not low or crude. On the contrary, it reflects the deep tension between reason and instinct. For example, nudity, being fully unclothed, is one of the most powerful acts of physical eroticism. When the people undress and stand naked before each other, it symbolizes the moment when they drop their personal defenses. In human civilization, clothing represents the boundaries we place on our bodies. To undress is to remove the fog and open oneself to the other person. According to Bataille, in a culture where nudity is considered taboo and shameful, the act of undressing can be as intense as a harmless form of killing. Why would he say that? Because taking off clothes feels like killing off the social roles and protective masks we wear each day. To bare bodies now meet directly, without filters. And the sexual act that follows, Bataille describes it as a violent kind of union. In physical exchange, the once separate individuals seem to merge into one, even if only for a moment. Their isolated identities, their separate structures begin to crack. Of course, physical eroticism alone still cannot erase our personal disconnection, because the body, by nature, offers only a brief climax. When the act ends, both people return to what is often called the wise man's moment, a time of silence, of distance, of solitude. In other words, physical union does not always create an emotional or spiritual bond that lasts, because the feeling of merging is so fleeting. And that means physical eroticism seeks a fleeting moment of crossing boundaries. Through giving and receiving physical touch, it briefly breaks through the loneliness of life. Because of this, humans are drawn to move beyond the body and into emotional eroticism. When love and desire come together, eroticism rises above momentary pleasure and becomes a deeper emotional union. In this situation, sex is no longer a simple physical act. It takes on profound emotional meaning. The passion of love makes the physical bond stronger and longer lasting. The people stay connected not just in body, but also in spirit. That is why Bataille wrote that only with the one you love can miracles happen that break through human limits. Only then can two lonely beings truly become one. That closeness, born from desire and love, reveals a much deeper emotional coherence. It shows us that love is the longing of two souls to stay joined forever. It tries to erase every distance between them. But Bataille also saw clearly that eroticism in love often hides even greater turmoil and pain. He believed that love itself contains the meaning of violence. It brings chaos and disorder. The desire for love is powerful because it reaches for something that may be impossible. Lovers in love always wish to fully possess one another, to merge into one being. But in reality, that desire often leads to painful separation. That is why emotional eroticism always carries anxiety and pain. The pain of never fully joining, the fear of losing the other person, and the endless demands love places on the heart. Bataille called this state a kind of suffering that comes from chasing the impossible. When two lovers try to find complete union in both emotion and body, they are, in fact, touching the edges of their own existence. It is precisely this experience of limits that makes people see pain as something close to happiness, or to go even further, that happiness itself can awaken even deeper pain and anxiety. In emotional eroticism, taboo and restrictions still exist, but they take different forms. Many social taboos around sex can be lifted within the private space of love. This allows people to freely indulge in the pleasure that such forbidden desire brings. But love itself can give rise to new taboos, such as rejecting outsiders or condemning betrayal, and so on. To love someone deeply often means being willing to give up everything for them, even your own life. That idea itself challenges the normal, rational principle of self-preservation. Because of this, the crossing of boundaries in emotional eroticism is more about emotions, commitments, and self-sacrifice. To love someone so much that you forget yourself. That is to break through the isolation of the self. Bataille believed that those in love are often willing to accept anxiety and risk because it is exactly that dizzying, fire-like feeling that defines true passion. In emotional eroticism, one does not only risk the body, but also risks the soul. The deeper the love, the more it demands stepping out of your own rational comfort zone toward the edge of madness and pain. Sacred eroticism is Bataille's third and most extreme form. It refers to a kind of erotic dimension that appears in religious or sacred rituals and spaces. This might sound contradictory. How can holiness and the sacred in religion have anything in common with eroticism? Yet Bataille, through examining early religions and mystical experiences, revealed a deep connection between religious ecstasy and the passions of the erotic. In his view, many human civilizations use sacred rituals as a way to confront ultimate taboos, those moral lines that must never be crossed. For example, the taboo against killing is a foundation of secular ethics, but within religious sacrifice, killing becomes something sacred. At the same time, many restrictions on sexuality are broken during religious festivals or mystical rites. Take the ancient Bacchic festivals. They were filled with indulgence and frenzy. To Bataille, the taboos of the secular world, whether about sex or death, are often deliberately violated in the world of the sacred. This means that religious rituals, in a way, become theaters of transgression. They are carefully constructed spectacles where participants are allowed to cross those forbidden lines and enter a state of ecstatic, sacred unity. Let us look at an example from the arts. Bernini's sculpture *The Ecstasy of Saint Teresa*. It vividly expresses the connection between religious ecstasy and earthly pleasure. In describing this moment, I want to read directly from her own words. "I saw in his hand a long spear, finely made, and at the tip of the iron blade there seemed to be a small flame. He drove it several times into my heart, piercing through to my very innards. And when he pulled the spear out, it felt like my organs were being torn away. Yet I was completely consumed. In the divine love of heaven, the pain was so intense that I could not help but cry out. Yet the sweetness born of that pain was something truly beyond this world. Unforgettable, sublime. I could not even bring myself to wish for release from him. Now, nothing fulfills my soul except God himself. This pain is not of the body, it is spiritual. Though my body also shares in some part of that pain. What lies between my soul and God now is the sweetest caress of divine love. I pray that the good Lord may allow those who think I am lying to personally experience this pain I have felt. Or perhaps this joy. And now, returning to our subject, this entire experience, in a way, affirms Bataille's vision of sacred eroticism because of that moment. The ecstasy of uniting with God mirrors the face of lovers at the peak of passion. They are almost indistinguishable. In this moment, the boundary between holiness and desire becomes blurred. In other words, in the throes of sacred ecstasy, what one feels is a sense of limitless fusion, either with the divine or with something far greater than oneself. For example, some medieval religious sects sought the state of divine madness through extreme asceticism and rapture. It feels almost platonic. Saint Teresa's mystical experience was described in her own words as her heart being pierced by God's love, an agony that was at the same time unspeakable bliss. These cases show us that religious experience often exhibits traits that resemble erotic climax, a state of overwhelming trance, loss of self, and a joy beyond words. Bataille believed this was no coincidence. He argued that both sacred and erotic experiences share a common goal, a desire to go beyond the self, to dissolve into something continuous. More precisely, the sacrificial rites of religion contain a profound erotic dimension. After all, sacrifice often involves the killing of a victim to offer one's life to God. That is the ultimate transgression of the taboo against death. In Bataille's view, eroticism and sacrifice are, in essence, the same. The only difference is sacrifice actually destroys life, while eroticism simulates that destruction symbolically. Bataille wrote in his book that the woman in erotic acts is like the offering, and the man acts as the priest who performs the rite. Moreover, for Bataille, death lies at the heart of all sacred eroticism. He believed that through approaching and imitating death, humans gain a powerful sense of continuity with life, a feeling that cuts deep down to the marrow. As Bataille himself stressed, without some element of destruction, whether violent or violating, without that, sexual acts struggle to reach full satisfaction. Only when danger and transgression fill the air can eroticism acquire a kind of sacred intensity, a frenzy that borders on the religious. This sense of danger, even of guilt, actually enhances the depth of pleasure and sacred eroticism by dancing between the lines, between holiness and the secular, between life and death, pulls its participants into a state of mystery, intensity, and transformation, regardless of the form it takes. All eroticism depends on the twin forces of taboo and transgression. Bataille believed that what makes us human, in large part, is our ability to create and honor taboos. Taboos are boundaries. They are limits set by civilization to preserve itself and its order. For example, the prohibitions against killing and incest. These taboos restrain our primal instincts, elevating us from animals to rational beings in a social world. But here lies the paradox. The very existence of taboos implies that one day they may be broken. That is because a taboo is not only something we are told to obey in some strange way. It exists to be challenged. The urge to violate the taboo is itself the taboo, but transgression is not meant to destroy or reject the taboo entirely. It is in the very act of touching the line that we feel both a thrill and a shiver. As Georges Bataille clearly pointed out, transgression does not erase the taboo. It depends on it. In other words, taboo and transgression exist together. The taboo creates the desire to break it, and when that desire is fulfilled, it only reinforces the power of the taboo. And among all taboos, sexual taboos may be the most universal and the most deeply rooted across all civilizations. Since ancient times, humans have regulated sexuality with shame and order. We have rules for how to dress, laws enforcing monogamy in marriage, and strict prohibitions against incest. All of these are meant to control sexuality, to prevent it from disrupting society or destroying family structure. But here's the twist. What makes sex so tempting is exactly this sense, how should I put it, of sneaking past the rules. The more forbidden it is, the more it draws us in. Bataille's insight lies here. The peak of erotic pleasure comes from doing what we know we are not supposed to do. The inner experience of erotica requires the person to feel deep anxiety about breaking the rules. And that anxiety, it must be even stronger than the desire itself. Think about it. When someone has sex for the very first time, there is often a secret sense of tension, even fear. That feeling, it comes from the knowledge that we are about to cross a sacred boundary, because what was once off limits is now within reach. The shadow of the taboo. It adds an extra layer of thrill to the act itself. It amplifies the pleasure. Now think about this. If there were no taboo at all, then sex would lose its tension and mystery. It would become just another routine. On this point, Bataille was direct. If the element of destruction, that feeling of violation, is missing, then eroticism loses its full satisfaction. That tells us something. Guilt, shame, anxiety, all those negative feelings, they do not kill the pleasure. They become part of the pleasure. Because they make you aware that you are crossing a line. And that moment of crossing, that is often the climax itself. For this reason, Bataille believed every transgressive act was a celebration of life at its peak, because it breaks through rational order and lets us face the raw power of being alive. Whether it is two bodies fully exposed to one another, whether it is lovers pledging life and death, or even the sacred rituals soaked in blood, they all confirm the intensity of life through acts that go beyond boundaries. That is why Bataille even called eroticism a place between life and death. It is an affirmation of life, an affirmation that lasts until death finally ends it. This sentence, it captures the true meaning of intimacy and transgression. By violating the taboo, we cross the boundary, and in that crossing, we embrace life in its most intense, most radical form, even if that moment brushes against death. Taboos warn us to stay away, but transgression tells us go ahead, just a little closer. It fills us with nervous excitement, a thrill on the edge of fear. As we inch closer, slowly, carefully, together, taboo and transgression weave the boundary between human desire and civilized order, a tug of war that never ends. The closer we get to the edge, the more intense life begins to feel. Yet that boundary never truly disappears. In fact, it becomes more visible every time we approach and push against it. From this perspective, Bataille saw eroticism as a ritual of constant transgression. We fulfill our desires like criminals, and the moment satisfaction ends, we return again to the rules that define us. In his analysis of sexuality, the link between sex and death was a constant, ever-present theme. The act of love and intimacy always carries with it the scent of death. For example, in French, there's a term that captures this perfectly. They call orgasm la petite mort, or the little death. It refers to that moment when the self seems to dissolve during climax, a fleeting loss of consciousness. In that instant, the borders of our awareness start to blur. Reason fades away. What we feel instead is a strange emptiness, a touch of the void. This resembles, in form and feeling, the silence that follows death. Both moments mark the end of the self. So Bataille believed that sexual ecstasy and confusion were our shortcut to experiencing death. Without dying, in orgasm, we feel a kind of burning surrender that mimics death. But this is not a denial of life. In fact, it's a way to get closer to death, so we can feel the shock of being alive even more intensely. Eroticism is an encounter with death, and the closer it gets to nothingness, the brighter the flame of life burns. Do you remember what I said about Marquis de Sade? Bataille was a devoted reader of his work, and he noticed something. In Sade's writing, sex, violence, and even death were fused in shocking ways. Sade turned cruelty. Sade merged violence directly into the narrative of sex, portraying acts of cruelty, driven entirely by desire. For centuries, his works were dismissed as the writings of a madman. But Bataille believed otherwise. To him, Sade's extremism revealed a deeper truth we've long refused to see. That truth is this: when love is pushed to its absolute edge, it begins to resemble a longing for death. It sounds like a contradiction, but it describes the farthest limits of passion. Great love often carries a willingness to die for it. Or worse, a desire for self-destruct born from love itself. We see this in history, in poetry, in myth. Romeo and Juliet, lovers who die for love. Or in ancient legend, Cupid and Psyche, who must cross the threshold of life and death to be united. These stories all echo one thing, that the final destination of love is often quietly pointing toward death. The deeper we love, the more we want to dissolve the boundary of our own life. And death is the ultimate disappearance of boundaries. So Bataille believed that the most intense erotic moments always carry a shadow of death. Sometimes we symbolically kill the self, or imagine being destroyed by another. In philosophy, this can be seen as a mirror held up to reality. The peak of pleasure looks a lot like the cliff edge of death. And to Bataille, whether it's religious ecstasy, the bloodlust of war, or the fatal thrill of erotic literature, they all spring from the same emotional architecture. In destruction and creation, in death and in desire, we are always reaching for something beyond ourselves. Yes, death is terrifying, but it is also endlessly seductive. Eroticism is no different. It disturbs our sense of morality, and yet we are thrilled by it. Because breaking the rules of ordinary life unleashes something wild, something raw, something deeply alive. In the end, we live in an age where the adult industry thrives, yet we are more lost in meaning than ever. Bataille's asterisk history of eroticism asterisk reminds us, eroticism has always been bound to our deepest spiritual and existential needs. And perhaps that's why, viewing sex purely as biology or entertainment, misses. It can never satisfy our longing for meaning. Labeling it as filth or obscene only robs us of the chance to understand ourselves more deeply. Because for each of us, Bataille's questions still burn with urgency. Between taboo and transgression, between ecstasy and the shadow of death, how should we truly understand what it means to be human? Maybe there has never been a ready-made answer, but Bataille gives us one possible direction. When we gaze into the depths of the erotic, we are also staring into the limits of our own humanity and our desire to transcend those limits. Sometimes, crossing a single forbidden line means more than living a lifetime by the rules. But this encounter with taboo is not a fall into depravity. It is the pursuit of rebirth through destruction. It is the longing for purity through the profane. Within our finite lives, we touch the edge of the infinite. And in that light, eroticism is not mere desire or pleasure, but a doorway to existence itself. On this path, love embraces death. The walls of taboo shake with every heartbeat. And there, in that trembling space, humanity glimpses its most unspeakable truths, buried in the deepest corners of the soul.